Welcome to another episode of the Group Dynamic Podcast. In the Group Dynamic Podcast, we are talking about various concepts related to group dynamics or interpersonal dynamics, as you might call it. And in this episode, we are continuing a discussion about the OLAB, the Organizational Laboratory or the Organizational Training, as it is called, which is a very unique concept. And we are focusing on a subset of this concept, which was developed in Klagenfurt, Austria, at the university. And this is Roland, based in Vienna, working at one of the universities of applied sciences, and me, Jürgen, based in Berlin, working at one of the universities of applied sciences. And the two of us are looking back at three different OLABs that we have attended throughout the last years, and we're trying to share our experience about what is happening in this very unique concept where the task is to create an organization that is capable to take a decision. And if you're interested in more details, I suggest that you listen to the first episode where we are talking specifically about what is the OLAB, what is the task, what is the time, and what is the territory. So what are the boundaries? And we already talked about the first plenary, the marketplace, where around 100 people are gathering each day to discuss certain things. And at the end of the last episode, we have realized that one option is to break up the large group, the plenary of the 100 people, into smaller groups to be able to do certain things, which was impossible in the large group. And in this episode, Roland and I are talking about what is happening in the smaller groups and how is a potential representative being selected. That's something we already also mentioned in the first episode. So Roland, I'm very happy to have you here again. Very excited to talk about your experiences as well.
Hello, Jürgen. I'm also happy to be here and to talk with you about an issue that does really interest me, which is organizational dynamics.
So let's talk about breaking up into the smaller groups. As far as I remember, we realized quite early that discussing things among 100 people, we were, I think, 111-ish, is impossible at a certain point. And like you mentioned in the last episode, the staff is not giving directions, they're making suggestions. And one suggestion was, if you want to, you can break up into smaller groups. There are 4 rooms in the hotel where we have met. So you can break up into smaller rooms. And what we did was we took this advice and we broke up into 4 subgroups, which were 25-ish people per subgroup, because 4 rooms, 100 divided by 4 seems to be 25. And this seems to have been the rationale in all that. And that didn't work very well, honestly, in the beginning. I don't know if there was the same pattern in your OLABs. So if you have broken up in the same way.
Well, we didn't have the situation of the 4 rooms, so we had more rooms available.
Okay.
But we still got the suggestion, like you said, maybe it's better to break up, and let's see how it works out if you gather together in small groups and talk to each other, so that everybody can hear everybody and you can find at least a decision within the small group, and then try to put it on the next level and somehow connect the small groups to a whole again. And what happened, so I have to differentiate now between 2 OLABs I visited. On the first OLAB, it happened that after a certain period of time, which was roughly 3 days, there were developed smaller groups. And this development was kind of ongoing and had a certain moment where you felt that the smaller group started to say no if an individual would show up and ask the people, well, can I sit down here and listen a little bit what you are talking within your smaller group?
So they were very close shops.
Yeah, so they started to close themselves.
But you're not
Because
talking
at the-
about like 25 people. You're talking about
No.
smaller.
So we didn't have this situation with the 4 rooms. So we were from the start. I think the largest groups were somewhat about 12 people or something. So this was pretty much very, very okay to talk to each other and to set up something like a common understanding and set up enough time for everybody to participate. So we didn't have this problem at the first OLAB I was participant at, that we decided to have 2 large groups. But it was also not really a decision. So the development was kind of fluid, because in the very beginning there was a lot of moving around. People left again, people joined other groups, people said, well, I want to try out a little bit, and so forth. And this lasted roughly until the 3rd day. And then suddenly there was something like a closing. And interestingly, this was very fascinating for me when I observed this in my own group, but also saw it at the other groups, that there was a certain moment when the group started to exclude visitors. When they said, no visitor, we have to talk ourselves, we have to find our decision, and we don't want to have visitors here, we don't want to have listeners here. And so this was the step where we finally, at the 3rd day, had a structure of several groups. But in our case, the largest group was something about roughly 12 to 13 people. Okay. So this worked out pretty fine. And this was, by that time, this was done. So that from that time on, the groups were, if you will, formed at this special organizational laboratory.
Interesting. That happened, I would say, much faster in our organization lab. It felt very structured, because we broke up into 4 groups with roughly 25 people, and then we tried to continue our work in the smaller group. And it was quite good from my point of view that one member of the staff was in the room, and I think she said, do you realize that you are replicating in the small LAL group what you already did in the large group, in the plenary? So 25 people still were too much. And at a certain point, I got so upset and so annoyed that I said, I have to get out of here. It doesn't work. We have to make the group smaller. And at a certain point, I jumped up. Before that, I asked the person next to me, do you want to join me? And we tried to find some other people in the room to join us as well. And then the small LAR group, the 25 people, also split up into small groups. That were the final group form for us. And while I'm saying that, it's quite interesting, because I often reflected about the process of creating the small group. We were 9 people in the end. And I just realized that the people who found together were taken from the 25. I never really considered trying to find someone from the other 3 smaller groups. So the selection process in itself is quite interesting for me. It felt quite rushed, and we ended up with a bunch of people, but there was no very clear process of forming groups. Except the one person I asked, do you want to join me? Because I liked him, because I know him from another situation in the OLAB when I arrived. So I felt I had already the opportunity to build trust to this person. And I just realized that I'm still trying to figure out about this group's creation process, how rational that was, how good that was, how helpful that was for the rest of the work. So this is how we ended up in the small group. So there were 3 stages: the plenary, the smaller group, and the small group for us. And then we immediately tried to claim our office, which was by a lake. You might remember the places, and there is a lake that you can go to like 300-400 meters away from the hotel, and we put up our office there. This is how it started for me.
And it's very interesting for me because I remember you said in our first episode regarding the OLAB that your authority in mind is that there has to be a person who has to be in charge, and that's the responsibility for the person to be in charge and to give directions. And I'm wondering, because you said there was, in your observation, no group process. And I'm wondering, actually, I would rather say it was a process where authority in mind was replicated.
I mean, there was a process, obviously. For me, the question is, how helpful was the process for the rest of the week, for how performant the organization is? But it's an answer that is impossible. It's a question that is impossible to answer, obviously. I'm just wondering how the process happened, and if I would do it the same way the next time, and if not, what would the difference be? Impossible to answer right now, just came up in my mind.
Yeah. Well, as far as I listened to you, the most impressive thing for me was that you talked a little bit about your emotions, and that for some reason you were emotional upset. And then you said, well, I want to make a smaller group. I want to go on with that, with less people. And this is for me a typical thing to do. It's something you decide. And if you will, it's a bifurcation. So let's say there are two decisions. One decision is to let a little bit more time to everybody, and to step back and to say, well, I'm feeling a lot of emotions, but I don't let me be pushed by the emotions. I just keep them. And the other decision would be, well, I take it in my hands. And I think it's not about good or bad, it's just what that does mean. And this is the interesting question you also asked right now. What does it mean when I do this and that? What do I create or not create, or and so forth? And I would say, if I compare that with what I told you about the OLAB, the first OLAB I did, I would say the process we had was probably kind of similar a little bit, because you're always looking out, at least I am, looking out for somebody who offers authority, who offers something like an idea, and let's do it this and that way. And on the other hand, I'm also tempted to offer that myself, to offer, well, let's do it. Let's do something. Don't wait. Let's do something. So, and I think you took the initiative, and by taking the initiative, you did somehow influence the system.
Absolutely.
But that's the interesting learning, I think, as a whole in the organizational laboratory, that you realize, first of all, that you have an impact, and second of all, that you might have a choice. So you might be able to do it another way. What you maybe never figure out is, or what you probably never figure out is, that the other way would is comparable, because whatever you do, time is always going on. So you always can say, well, in the past I did this, and in the next organizational laboratory I will try that. And this is practically what happened to myself. So because of my experiences in the first organizational laboratory or organizational training, OLAB, I decided to have several things changed at the second one I participated with. And this gives you other points of view. This gives you other experiences. The interesting thing is that you can say it differs, and it might be better or worse. It's also dependent on your own wishes and on your own whatever you would like to happen or would like to make happen. And so that's an interesting thing. So it's interesting for me that the process you just described was very fast. So you set up very fast the small group. And if I got it right, you played a leading role in that, because you said, well, I have to go now, who wants to follow me? So this is, if I only take the wording you use, that's a decision to take the lead and to ask others whether they follow you.
Yeah. When you say it that way, it sounds very positive. Taking the initiative, taking the lead, doing things, being very fast. Usually things for me that are connotated very positively. But at the same time, it's also anxiety avoidance. So if a group, or if I'm acting very fast, I'm also wondering what I'm running away from. So I don't have to negotiate if I'm just creating facts. People just have to follow. So I'm participating in the rush, and every time I'm creating a rush, maybe other things are avoided. And I'm still thinking about the anxiety in the plenary in the first episode, when we talked about the authority that doesn't act based on my fantasy of authority. When people fall back into patterns to raise their hand if they want to say something, and that pattern doesn't work. So from my point of view, there seems to be a lot of anxiety in this organization that is evolving. And one way to deal with anxiety is to push the responsibility to the authorities, which we discussed in the first episode. And the other way to deal with anxiety is to get into the role of authority, or be pushed into the role of the authority by the group, by other members of the group unconsciously, and to be very fast, because that gives you the good feeling of having accomplished something, quote unquote.
Yeah, and the interesting thing for me is also you are duplicating or replicating your authority in mind.
Absolutely.
So you keep up the thing you are used to, and probably you feel comfortable because you know how this works, and so it's a sort of conservative action. It conserves your authority in mind. It replicates the system. It replicates the system by you stepping into the authority you would like to have seen in the stuff. And this is one way you can do it. That's a possibility. The question is only whether you do it consciously as a decision, or whether you are just, like you told, just running away from anxiety or seeking security in a routine you feel comfortable with, stuff like that.
So in this process alone, I think there are a lot of things that are good starting points for reflection. But now being in the small group, so if we tick this box, so to speak, we are now in the very small group, the 9 to 12 people, however you choose. The first dilemma, or the first challenge we were faced with, was how do we take a decision in the small group? Because this is the task for the large group. So how are we going to do it in the small group? And that was quite easy for us, I would say. After a very brief discussion, let's say an hour or so, I would say, we came up with the idea that we have to have a 2/3 majority. So 2/3 of the people have to be for something, which means 6 people if we were 9. So that was quite convenient. And the 3 who would be against it, they can be against it, but they have to live with it. And there would be the option to come up with a veto. So if out of the 9, 8 people would say, yes, I'm for it, or I can live with it. And 1 person would say, I put in my veto. I'm against it. I'm totally against it. Then we would have had to renegotiate that. So we would have started from scratch. I don't think we ever had to test that in a very tricky situation, but it worked well for us in all other situations. So there was not a really very critical situation, but for all others, it works well. And I'm stressing the critical situation because I remember an incident at the very end, at the last day, when we all came together and we finally made it. We created an organization that was capable to take a decision. The question was asked in a living sociogram. So we had to move in the large room. The question was asked, do you think you are capable to take a decision? Yes or no? And people would have to move to the left side of the room or to the right side of the room. And I would have expected everyone to be on the side yes. And a lot of people were on the room side where it said, no, we're not capable to take a decision. And that made me furious because that was something we worked towards throughout the week. And I realized maybe we all worked based on the illusion that we are able to take a decision. But maybe that's something for the end to discuss. So decision making in the small group was one of the first things that we discussed. And the second one was, and you mentioned that in the first episode, should we send a representative of the small group into a group of representatives? Because, and you also mentioned that in the first episode, it is impossible among 100 people to negotiate, to discuss. So one way to solve that is a representative. So I'm curious how you solved that. The decision making, was that also a topic for you, and the question of the representative?
Yeah, well, both was a topic for me. And interestingly, I thought where you now told your story, I thought, well, you just now gave a very clear replicate of your picture of authority.
Yeah.
And my question is, you always said, well, we decided to have this 2/3 rule and we decided to have the veto rule. And for me, when I look at group processes and at processes where groups develop, and Tuckman and Ewald Kreins did put something to it also. He said there is a need of a warming phase before you come to the storming phase and so forth. And I said, when the idea is right that you took the lead, then I would highly doubt that there was something like a group process on the decision of this 2/3 rule. I would rather say this was an authoritative decision covered in a democratic veil, and because maybe of the anxiety of not being able to discuss, because of the anxiety that discussion eats up time. And so what I would say is, if I compare it to the process I had in my first organizational laboratory, the process was way slower. There was a lot more of discussion going on. But there were also different kind of people that wanted to have a higher speed, people that wanted to slow it down, and so forth. So there were, you might say, processes parallel in time, but a huge amount. And it was, even in the small group, it was very hard to keep track. Very, very hard to keep track of that. And the thing is, what I believe in and what I've seen or what I hear when you describe your experience, and if I compare it with my experience, one thing is that you have the ability, if you are a strong leader yourself, if you have a strong hierarchical pattern, then you can do what you did. You take over the small group, because the small group is small enough to take it over and to become their leader. But
maybe that's your fantasy at that point.
yeah, that's. But let me. That's my fantasy. Totally, you're totally right. But let me go on, because I want to come to the point where you were furious in the end. So now, what you try to put into the system is your idea of leadership and your idea of authority, and you finally are able to do this in the small group. But where it comes to its natural boundary is again when you are confronted with all the other hundreds. Because now you in your small group realized this system, and it obviously worked. You had this 2/3, you had the minority, and so forth. But it worked in the small group. And this is only a fraction of that what was tried to become the whole organization of the 111, like you said, people. And now you have exactly this problem, that even if you are able to have a solution in the small group, and I'm not saying that's worse or that's better or that another solution should be just, you have in your small group, you have a solution. You say, well, it seems to be fine for us, we can live with that, and well, that's okay. Then still you don't have addressed the bigger problem. And so now you can see, and this is probably one of the biggest learnings I had myself, that I realized what time it takes. And even if you are fast in a small group, even if you manage that within the week, which is already, I think, a big achievement, if you manage to have a small group that is pretty much able to take a decision, then you don't have managed the whole organization, which is another big step to do, and which also needs, again, negotiations between those people you call delegates. And so the same thing happened on my side. We had, well, not the same thing. We were slower, so it took us much longer to develop the group. And somehow we decided for a delegate. But what happened in our group was that there was a big conflict that ate up a lot of time within the group. So there was a conflict between individuals within the small group we found ourselves, and this conflict ate up a lot of time and had different layers, and made it very interesting, because we got a little bit out of sight the whole process. We got a little bit out of sight of this problem of representative or a delegate and stuff like that. Yeah.
It's interesting that you're mentioning delegates, and I've talked about representatives, and these are two different words for me, because if you have someone who is a representative of the group, for me that would be different than to have a delegate. But that might be an interesting topic for the next episode of the podcast, where we will talk a little bit about, is there a difference between a representative and a delegate? Why is this individual necessary? Should it be just one? Or should it be two? Because you need a deputy. And why do you even need them? Because you have to deal with the larger problem, Roland, like you mentioned, to deal with the 100. So let's talk about that in the next episode. Thank you very much for listening. Roland, thank you very much for being here with me. And I'm looking forward to hear and see you in the next episode.